Cuphead has become a very popular franchise now that the Cuphead show has come out. And with Season 2 on the horizon, the DLC coming out soon, and a possible children's book in the works, we wanted to discuss more Cuphead topics. Like any major franchise, there are plenty of popular and unpopular opinions throughout the community, and we wanted to discuss how we feel about these opinions. I'm Kyle with 1UP Binge, and this is Cuphead Opinions We Love and Hate. The first opinion/critique that we wanted to discuss is the art style is bad. Now, art is subjective, and a lot of this list is going to be subjective as well. However, we don't understand this take. Not really. We've praised the game's art style on a number of occasions already, because we absolutely love the vibe and the beauty within the game. And we'll talk more about those praises for the style shortly. But we can chat a bit about some of the shortcomings. Some character designs, while obviously based on other characters, like Captain Brittybeard being based on Bluto from Popeye, and Sally Stageplay's design being inspired by Olive Oyl, those designs aren't the most creative, and Dr. Kull may fit that bill as well. But even the worst designs aren't enough to make us dislike the art style. Now, we respect all opinions, but with all due respect, we hate this one. On the opposite side of the spectrum is the opinion that Cuphead's style and beauty are unmatched. This opinion comes from Twitter user Absolute Katie in a tweet about the game Enchanted Portals, which looked to be obviously inspired by Cuphead. Basically, they said that while Enchanted Portals was obviously inspired by Cuphead, there is room for both games because Cuphead's style and beauty are unmatched. We love Cuphead's art style as well. The 1930s aesthetic, watercolor backgrounds, and hand-animated characters make the game a beautiful romp with intriguing character designs and shockingly lovely effects throughout the course of the story. We like where this one's coming from because Cuphead's style is unique. But games like The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption, and Hollow Knight are just a few examples of games that we think are more beautiful visually than this game. So we can't say that Cuphead's beauty is unmatched. But we will say that we like this opinion and agree with it to a point. A take so bad that it became a meme, we wanted to discuss the classic Cuphead is like Dark Souls idea. Dark Souls and Souls-like games have become quite popular over the years, with games in the Souls series or offshoots like Elden Ring or Bloodborne, as well as Souls-inspired games like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, getting plenty of praise and positive reviews. This leads to anything remotely difficult being compared to Dark Souls. And of course, with Cuphead's difficulty. It was no surprise when it was also compared to the amazingly difficult Souls series. Now, we can confidently say that the games aren't even remotely similar. Sure, both games are difficult, but that's really where the comparison ends. So it's a no-brainer that we hate this take, especially since it's pretty lazy and contrived, and also pretty deserving to be memed on. Similarly, Polygon in their review says it's close to a puzzle game rather than comparing it to Dark Souls. The reason they say this is because it requires a good memory and even better reflexes. And honestly, it's not that bad of a point because after recently replaying through some of it, once you recognize patterns and understand how each boss works, it does become closer to completing a puzzle, rather than fighting an enemy. Sure, it's not marketed as a puzzle game, and it doesn't give you the time and resources to beat it like a typical puzzle game would. But we like the logic, and we have to agree with it to a point. So we'll definitely say that we like this opinion. Now, that same Polygon article also says that it isn't even that hard, which is another massively subjective point, because certain people find different things difficult compared to others. Now, in our opinion, that is, the writer of this script and myself, the game is exceedingly difficult, and especially for people who have a problem focusing. That said, I suppose for other people it could be exceedingly easy. So in defense of Polygon, we can't say they're wrong here. We don't fully agree because we think for most people it is indeed difficult. So we'll just say we have mixed feelings on this take. Another take that Polygon has is that they call Cuphead unexpectedly accessible. Now, this means a couple of different things, but the main idea of it is that Cuphead is relatively easy to learn. All of the weapons are easy to figure out, and the special abilities change gameplay just enough for it to feel different with each major ability. The customization of your character's abilities and weapons make it accessible to a wide variety of types of players, and while it doesn't necessarily make it easier, it does make it a better experience for everyone. So we absolutely agree and love this take. Moving on, they also say that self-taught lessons make you feel better upon victory. This is another pretty simple thing to discuss. Basically, what they're saying is that your failures help you learn more than your victories. Each time you fail, you find out how to avoid the thing you died to, the timing or patterns of an attack, so you can better survive in your next attempt. The game exemplifies your deaths as a learning experience rather than as an annoyance, although it does tend to get annoying after dying a bunch of times. That said, we don't fully agree. Some bosses are designed in such a way where they're very hard to deal with, but dying doesn't really help you. Bosses like Phantom Express, where each phase is uniquely different, or King Dice and his henchmen, where even though the henchmen are relatively simple, it's completely random which boss you land on. So we have mixed feelings on this idea, because while it is true in most cases, we do find certain bosses completely adverse to this idea, as we mentioned earlier. A bit similar to the previous point, Polygon also says the boss fights punish pride. The point of this take is quite simple. Becoming prideful during a boss fight often leads to a death. If you think you know how a boss works either from playing it or watching someone else's playthrough, you'll tend to get killed because the bosses have such varied patterns that it's nearly impossible to understand every nuance on your first attempt. So we like this opinion because it makes a lot of sense. And getting cocky because you think you understand the patterns really well will oftentimes get you killed. The final point we want to talk about from Polygon's review is the finale is the worst part. The finale of Cuphead takes place in Inkwall Hell, where after you've taken all of the debtor's soul, you must handle both King Dice and the devil. They say that the difficulty here defeats the earlier points of punishing pride and self-taught lessons and instead is difficult for difficulty's sake, and that this part of the game is the worst because it doesn't fit with the rest of the lessons given throughout the game. Now, we kind of dislike this take, because the finale does fit Cuphead quite well, and has the grandiose sense of scale that should come from a great game. And although they're not wrong about how it is very difficult, much more so than previous battles, the ending levels are a lot of fun. Another take we want to talk about is the run and gun sections are not needed. In between various boss battles are 5 run and gun sections. Each of these sections include Cuphead and or Mugman running through a long stage, fighting various foes and a mini-boss at the end. They can be quite fun, if repetitive at times, but we can see why people wouldn't like them. Throughout the game, these sections have unique mechanics, such as the one where you reverse gravity, and unique enemies. But I suppose we like this opinion because you could remove these sections and not much would be lost beyond breaking up the monotony of certain back-to-back boss fights. Coming from a Reddit thread is the opinion that Cala Maria, Beppy, and Baroness von Bonbon are not hard to beat. This comes from the Redditor Yeastman in a post entitled Unpopular Boss Opinions, I Think, where he breaks down each of these bosses and says none of them are hard to beat. They say they beat Cala Maria in less than 10 tries, and the only part of Beppy that is hard is the horse section. Now, we can't fully agree nor disagree because, like Yeastman points out, certain people have problems with different bosses for different reasons. Though we will say that we do like this opinion because the person doesn't say it like a fact or an objective truth. In response to the previous post, Redditor RR Harv brings up the claim that Cala Maria is hard to S-rank. Now for context, the coveted S rank is a ranking you can only get by completing very specific things during a boss battle. This includes parrying 5 or more items, using 6 or more special moves, keeping all of your health, and doing it within a certain amount of time. Completing an S rank is quite difficult with most bosses, but RR Harv brings up a very specific reason why Cala Maria, in particular, is very hard to S rank. This is because of phases 2 and 3, where she gains the ability to freeze you in midair. This causes things to take longer, but also causes you to take damage from dumb moves because, especially in phase 3, where you're moving through a cave and are forced to be petrified, with no way to get out of it, you're going to take damage more often than not. Not to mention she can only be damaged from being shot in the face and nowhere else. So we fully agree and love this opinion, because there's no denying that she is difficult to S-rank. Another Reddit opinion is that Dr. Calls Robot's difficulty is overstated. According to Redditor The Sweet 2086, this boss's difficulty is exaggerated. In reality, the reason why the boss is so hated is the fact that it's a really long fight, but overall, not super difficult. Even Phase 3, which is the one most people complain about, is actually quite the simple bullet hell section compared to more difficult games of the genre. Sure, Dr. Calls Robot is rightfully hated, because of the fight's sheer length, and the fact that you have to deal damage to certain bits of the robot to progress can be quite annoying. But we'll say that we don't like this take, because it's common to see people congratulating themselves for beating the boss, which shows that it's pretty common for people to agree that Dr. Call's robot is pretty tough. From the same thread is the claim that Grim Matchstick is not unfair. This take comes from Nice Resource 3749, who says that people complain about Grim Matchstick's difficulty, but all it requires is skill to beat the boss. But let's talk about why people call him unfair. In his first phase, Grim fires ripples from his eyes, 3 at first and 4 after being damaged some. Now this can be seen as unfair because you don't know what this threshold is. It just sort of happens. He also shoots a wave of fireballs at you, but after reaching a similar unknown threshold, he'll sometimes fire a crisscross version of the attack with no way to tell. Phase 2 is where most players get damaged, but the attacks are relatively telegraphed. In Phase 3, he has a few attacks, but nothing particularly unfair. That said, the most unfair part of this battle is the constantly moving stage. You need to always be on the move, unlike in other boss battles where staying in one place can actually be a good strategy. But we have to say that we don't like this opinion either, because Grim's moveset is designed in such a way that it definitely seems unfair when compared to other bosses. The last opinion from that same thread is that Baroness Von Bonbon is the definition of unfair. Von Bonbon is one of the most hated bosses alongside the previous 2 we've talked about. This is because for the first couple phases, you don't even fight her but one of her subjects. There is no telegraphing which of these subjects will appear, even though all of them are quite simple to deal with, and you'll likely be damaged and killed the first dozen or so times simply by her subjects. And even her final phase brings up the Grim Matchstick problem of a moving stage. So we have to agree and say that we like this opinion. Next up is the idea that the DLC's bosses don't look as interesting. As far as we're aware, all the bosses for the Delicious Last Course have been revealed in some capacity, and we can see why some people find these boss designs less likable and more forgettable than the base game bosses. The Chess Knight, Glumstone, the Giant, and Sheriff Winchester are a few of the bosses we've seen, and their designs aren't really anything to write home about. In fact, 2 horse bosses is kinda weak. Now that's not to say that the fights themselves can't be great, but the boss designs fall in line with some of our least favorite bosses like Sally Stageplay and Captain Brinnybeard. So we do like this opinion because we agree, though we are hopeful that some of these bosses will grow on us as more of their gameplay is revealed. The final opinion we want to talk about is Miss Chalice's new mechanics seem game-breaking. In the trailer, we see Miss Chalice has a few different unique abilities that Cuphead and Mugman don't seem to have access to. These include the ability to double jump, parry while dashing, and her first super art goes vertically instead of horizontally. In a potential reference to the meme we spoke about earlier, and a potential reference to Dark Souls, she has a dodge roll, a common move in those games, and the most often used ability in these games. Her plane weapons also work differently, which makes her an entirely unique character. Now this could be one of 2 things. Either A, these are abilities that can somehow be shared with Cuphead and Mugman, or B, they designed all the bosses in the DLC around these abilities, so that you have to play Miss Chalice. We honestly hope for the first option, because these abilities will likely break base game bosses to some degree, because we know Miss Chalice can be used in the base game. We will say that we don't like this opinion, mainly because we are hopeful that it won't be used just by Miss Chalice, and therefore won't be game-breaking. If they are unique to her character, it would almost feel useless to play as Cuphead or Mugman. But let us know in the comments section if you agree or disagree with these opinions, and tell us what we should cover next. And if you need a one-up, hit that notification bell and binge more of our videos, like our Cuphead bosses from Weak to Powerful video. Thanks for watching.